Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dualistic Unity movie review series. I am keeping things light. I've been, looking into, I don't know, more of the depths and darkness of the system. What the fuck's going on with all of it, and maintaining as best as I can a degree of lightness through it all, because as much as dark as that gets, letting that overcome me and my mentality and everything doesn't really do anybody any good. Doesn't do anything to shift the collective mentality that is perpetuating a system as fucked up as the one we have. So keeping it light for those who may be looking into that system as well is the best advice that I can offer.
And I don't know what's happening. I think it's really important to remember that along the journey to unraveling the layer upon layer of collective nightmare in terms of what the system might be doing. It's so easy to get an idea of what's happening in the world and to forget that the world is huge. But that said, it's also very important to keep an eye on what is happening and the general trajectory of things, because the world is very much the result of our collective level of responsibility, which is the result of our individual level of responsibility. And so it really just comes down to us, each and every one of us. And if everyone in the world had just given up, at least there's you. And that's something. Doesn't matter how little you might think that is, it could be all we need. That all said, today's movie review is of Soylent Green, which came out in 1973 and stars Charlton Heston. It's a fantastic movie. It's actually based on a novel called Make Room, which came out in 1966 and was written by Harry Harrison. The point of Soylent Green, I think, is a note of warning, more or less, that things can really get out of hand. And unless we are all aware of that fact, we won't notice it, because generation by generation, we just lose sight of what we've lost. And so Soylent Green takes place laughably in the year 2022. And I think the reason for that, of course, was the fact that it was 1966 when the story was written. And at that point, the population in New York City was 15 million. In the movie Soylent Green, they are putting it in a future where the population of New York City alone is 40 million. And so they were trying to guess, I think, how long it would take us to get there. And this is what I mean very much about we don't know. We don't know. But let's assume it didn't take place in the year 2022, but some unknown future. I was explaining to my daughter, let's imagine it's 2040, 2050, the year 2100, that kind of thing. Either way, it's not too far away, regardless of how you look at it, if we continue on the trajectory that the movie is trying to get across. And the movie is very much trying to get across that the more people there are, the less humanity there is, the less valuable each and every one of us seems to be. And so before I go any further, I'm going to pass it to Andrew, who I know has never seen this movie.
Yeah, and before we get into it, as always, lots of spoilers are to come. So if you haven't seen it, pause it, watch it, or if you don't give a shit about that, then keep listening or watching. But yeah, I see this movie as very symbolic as our collective shift away from basically that shift of being more and more divided from nature is what it seems to be. Because just from the start of the movie, it kind of goes through those scenes and a quick progression of history, and you can kind of see as there's less nature involved, more city, more industrial things taking place, more humans, and it kind of runs through that, and then it gets to the beginning of the movie in 2022. Population of New York City's about 40 million, and it's just a shitload of people. It shows garbage dumps and all of these things, just a lot of waste, a lot more of everything. And so I think that shift then, if we just jump all the way ahead to the end of the movie, towards the end when it's showing, the suicide area, is showing nature again. And this is something that Dr. Thorne had never seen before. And so I think it's just very symbolic overall of our shift away from being nature, getting lost in identity, idea of ourself, overpopulation, and the implications of that, and the reality that we don't want to look at because we don't want to see beyond our current situation. We don't want to see beyond our idea of ourselves. And so we're very much blind to those secondary, tertiary implications of these things we keep pushing. We need more people to push along a system that needs more people. And then it's like this back and forth thing until, we get to a point where it's just too much and we have to take other actions in order to sustain that level of a population. And so overall, I see the movie as just having a lot of symbolism and I don't know, something that, as Ray said, is a warning to what the implications may be if we continue on the trajectory that we're going almost inevitably.
I think the thing that stood out to me the most was the fact that it didn't matter if they were rich people or poor people. Everybody was collectively suffering to some degree compared to the world that they had long since lost. Even rich people had to scrounge for, like, look at this, a piece of genuine beef like you've never seen in your entire life. And they're like, yeah, look at me, all privileged with my celery stalk, right? And it's only in comparison to what they know. They don't even know what they've lost. This is why you feel so much for the character of Saul, because Saul actually grew up in the world as it was before it disappeared. And so he knew what he had lost, which is why that meal, I think it's my favorite scene of the movie, is when he gets the actual genuine food and Thorne and Saul are sitting down and they're eating the food, and you can just feel the joy in like every bite. Like you can feel how good that meal is because they've never, like they never have anything like that. And I know from just being on the bottom end of things, not having food, not having any access to anything, like just barely scraping by, that, man, an actual meal when you haven't had one, it's a divine experience. It's the most beautiful thing, but it's almost tragic that it comes in such contrast to everything else. And so I love that scene in the movie because real food doesn't exist anymore. And here they are just taking advantage of every bite. And that is the beauty that still exists in each and every moment for every human being who can manage to touch it. But it's harder and harder and harder for us to touch it because we are so overcrowded. It's interesting. Just for shits and giggles, I decided I was going to go and look up the psychological effects of overcrowding. And according to the American Psychological Association, crowding has a damaging effect on mental health in that it creates poor performance on complex tasks, it increases physiological stress, and in non-human animals, it has impaired reproduction, decreased life expectancy, and created a variety of pathological behaviors. Overcrowding is a serious, serious problem. We talk about it in prisons, but we never talk about it in society because, frankly, we would have to change the way we live in order to avoid it. And you'll have a lot of people like Elon Musk, for example, say, oh, lots of planet, lots of Earth out there, lots of places that we can live. And it's the most dismissive kind of argument ever. Because I remember, I think it was like 2005, there was an article where basically they took the population of the world at the time and they broke up all of the land area, including the uninhabitable parts of the world, like mountaintops, deserts, things like that. And they broke it up per person. And I think it worked out that each person ended up with like 100 meters squared or something like that. And that was in 2005. The population continues to grow. It's just that now we've started building upwards. So we can't see as much of the population as is actually there. That's why we have high rises and giant projects like the line, that kind of thing. It's the reason that we need to continue modifying how we live because we are not going to change the way that we live. We're not going to change our motivators. And that's the problem. The motivators are what's damaging to us. The motivators are what's blinding us to the obvious consequence, which is why, again, in this movie, the thing that I enjoyed the most was the fact that everybody was screwed. And yet everybody was continuing on as if it was business as usual, including the people who knew what Soylent Green was. The one person who had a bit of a soul, who had a bit of problems with it, was murdered at the beginning of the movie. So the rest of them could just continue on making money in the name of God, I think he said at the beginning of the movie, because somehow it would be the worst thing for everybody to realize how fucked they really were.
Yeah, I see all of that as it's almost seems like the system has gotten so big that people are no longer even close to being in control of it. Like it's very much its own entity. And it's not to say that the system isn't also all of the people, but it's gone so far that they almost don't see any other options. Whereas where we're at right now, like, yeah, the system's fucking massive. It's like almost feels too big to change or shift, but it isn't. And we keep trying to shift the system, change the system, fight the system, but it's the underlying mentality that's created the system. Like the system is a mentality. It's not one single person or a group of people or anything. It's a mentality that has grown and kind of like infiltrated our reality. And so we're all taking a part in that mentality and pushing that mentality and perpetuating that mentality and not realizing that the system is just an embodiment of the collective mentality. And so in this movie, I think it does a great job of showing the implications of allowing that system to kind of just grow to such an extent. And we're so blind to the implications of it that it can get to a point that we would deem to be absolutely atrocious and terrible and awful and arguably one of the worst types of situations we could end up in. And yet we're so lost in it because we don't see any other way of doing things that it's like there isn't a way to change it anymore. Like they get to a point where they're actually utilizing the population to feed the population. And it's like that vicious cycle of doing so. And as opposed to, the other option, if they were to see how absolutely fucked up that was, they could stop and then people would begin to die off. But it's like they now, it's not only that they need the people for food, but they need them in order to perpetuate the system and in order to continue on with the system. Because in the alternative, if they stopped, using, if Soylent Green wasn't a thing and they stopped using it in the way that they were using it, people would start dying off because they're utilizing the nutrients. And if people started dying off, that system would crumble and they would have to start anew. And instead of taking a step back and thinking maybe there's a different way we could do that, it's just so solidified, so ingrained that it's like, oh, it's the way it is. And those who could make that decision are getting at least a glimpse of what life used to be like. They have their comfortable apartments, they have their furniture girls, all of those things. They have food, relatively normal food, still not, meat or beef or anything like that, or it's very rare, but they have enough of a comfort. They don't want to let that go. And everyone else is kind of blind to what's actually happening. So they'll just take what they can get. They'll just take what they can get to survive. And you see it with the suicide situation, that there's more and more people who are just willingly stopping with their existence. They'd rather not exist than exist in that situation. And we're actually seeing things like that start to come up in our current reality. Like it's not really that far off, but they get so lost in that mentality and fixated on that system that it almost becomes too powerful to even shift. They don't even know what they could possibly do because they're so lost in it. And it's such a vicious cycle that no one can even begin to see their way out.
I wanted to touch quickly on the idea of furniture that is introduced in this movie, specifically female furniture. And by that, I mean people who are just owned. Now, I'm going to venture out and say that there are also male furniture in this world because everybody has their own preferences. And the point that I was making at the beginning of this episode was that as there are more and more people, it is easier to value them less. And we see that all the time in terms of the job market and employment as a whole. Like we understand the more people out there who are willing to work for that same job, the less you're likely to get paid for that job because there's a lot of competition. A lot of other people would like your job. And so it becomes easier and easier and easier to devalue people, to get them for cheaper and cheaper and cheaper because they honestly, what's the alternative? Being willing to sacrifice their integrity or starve and possibly die. And that's the choice. And so this movie, this story takes that to the extreme end where there are some people, and Cheryl even communicates it like, I don't want to be out on the street. I don't want to live like the rest of everybody else. Right. This is at least comfortable, even though I'm not my own person. Unfortunately, you could tell it bothers her to be called furniture, and who wouldn't be bothered being called furniture? It's so dismissive. It's so inhuman. And so that is already happening. We see that all the time in terms of people being paid minimum wage and being treated like they're worth minimum wage rather than being treated like people who are invaluable. Everybody is being measured according to their value, and that's only going to get worse as there are more and more people. Supply and demand, right? When you have an oversupply, you pay less. In general, there's less value that is perceived. And so that is what we are becoming, is a commodity. And what's interesting is that when Saul goes to the exchange and they finally have a chance to look over the books that reveal, in fact, that the oceans are dead, Soylent Green is not made from plankton, and what the reality actually is. And he asks them, why? Why would they do this? And at first, the response is, it's easier. And then secondly, the response is expedient. Expedient is the perfect word. And expedient is actually defined as convenient and practical, although possibly improper or immoral. And that is unfortunately our default as humanity. We often tend towards expedient in the same way that Saul did at the end of the day. Instead of opting to stay around to fight the situation that he knew was in terms of people being Soylent Green, he decided to opt out. It was too much for him. In the same way, it was too much for the priest, knowing the truth, that this was how far things had gone. But we have to be able to look at these things in order to face them. We have to have the strength to not forget our influence, to not forget that there is always something we can do to turn the tide. In the case of overpopulation, changing our priorities as individuals.
Yeah, I think that's what we discount. And I was kind of alluding to this idea that the system seemed like it became too big. And that's not quite the case. There's that perception. And I think that's why the people who do see it for what it is, be it the priest or Simonson at the start of the movie or Saul, they just kind of crumble. They don't want to. They feel like there's nothing they could ever possibly do, and that is almost a byproduct of a system that just seems so big that it feels like there's nothing we can do. But that's never the case. No matter how big and powerful it may seem, no matter how much we think it may be dictating our experience, we still have our experience. We still have our responsibility for ourselves, despite how crazy and out of hand things may get. And when we get so lost in the idea that there's nothing we can do and we do start to give up, it's like that's when that system just steps on the gas and it leads to something like a Soylent Green type situation. But as long as we maintain the recognition that we are that system, as we shift, the system shifts, even if it feels like it's barely doing anything, maintaining that understanding of your own influence changes everything, because that has a ripple effect. As long as people can see other people who recognize their influence, they'll see that it's still a possibility. But as those who start to see it for what it is and just crumble in the face of how fucked up and how dark and how awful it may seem, the hope begins to be lost even more in everyone. So it's just important in the face of a system like we have right now to maintain that understanding that you still have influence, to maintain that degree of lightness, of that ability to dance in the midst of the fiery flames and everything that's happening, because that is what will shift it. That is what will begin to shift it. It's not the anger and loss of hope and all of the actions that come from that in terms of trying to fight it that change it, because you're fighting a mentality, and through that desire to fight it, adding to the mentality that you're trying to fight. And so it's dropping that. It's shifting that mentality that actually allows the change to be made. And each and every moment, you see it for what it is, and you keep things light despite it. You are shifting it. You are making ripples every single time that happens. And I think in this movie, it just seemed like it was so far gone that no one thought they had any influence anymore. And so there was almost nothing done despite it. And even the people who did see it for what it was, either they gave up and they went to the suicide thing, or they got bought out. Like it seemed like that's what Hatcher, Thorne's boss or side detective or partner or whatever he was, did. He tried to shut down the investigation. And so it's like you either have your price or you give up. And there is another option that I don't think people were willing to look at, because we discount the amount of influence we have on the system.
And we don't like the amount of pain that's going to be involved in that change. That's the thing. We get so comfortable with the devil that we know. Like, even in the story of Soylent Green, looking at how far gone that world is, thinking to yourself, well, how would they change things? What would they do? Like, let's assume that the ending is slightly different, that Thorne doesn't, in fact, run back to the city, get shot, call Cheryl, basically say, just give up, try and get whatever you can out of your life. And then, the end of the movie ends with his hand up in the air with blood on it to symbolize like the blood is on our hands and all that stuff. Let's assume that in fact he lives, gets out of the hospital or wherever he is, goes, gets Cheryl, gathers the people, starts talking about the fact that Soylent Green is made of humans, starts creating an impact so people aren't willing to abide by the system's rules. They're even worse in terms of riots, things like that. Everything breaks down. There's a whole structural collapse in terms of people dying of starvation, frankly, and one side versus the other, because everybody's going to be scrambling for whatever kind of control they can. And there's all kinds of fallout that would come from that. But what's the inevitable end result? Humanity's population declines in order to become balanced with nature, and whatever is left of us continues on and finds a new way to live. And this is what happens in nature all the time when something overgrows its environment and the environment fights back and peels it down. So that way it's more in line with, or it's more in balance with everything else, right? It's just that we resist that all the time. We see that with the US and the debt ceiling. God, that's my favorite example of this, because here's, the conceptual limit, and we're just like, well, let's just push that up a bit each and every time, right? The too big to fail mantra from 2008, perfect example. it's always about what's expedient. It's always about what's easiest rather than what needs to be done. And so here we are limping on towards the next financial crisis, and it's going to be worse because we keep pushing it off. We keep pushing it off. I mean, it was the tech bubble, and then it was the housing bubble. I think right now we're in the middle of a currency bubble, and that's going to be nasty. So we just keep putting off the inevitability. We just keep putting off the inevitable. The system is badly designed, and it's badly designed because our mentality isn't really coming from a point of clarity. It's really just coming from a point of expedience. What makes me feel good now? And since we're collectively on that trajectory, we're just settling for less and less and less.
Yeah. And because we're not willing to face that potential discomfort, it's like each and every year, every couple years, we just keep kind of settling upon that. And it's I think it's a combination of a lot of things, but it's also an unwillingness to recognize when enough is enough for yourself. Like we were talking about on Twitch a little bit yesterday, seeing the system for what it is, people for what they are. People at the bottom of that system are still, no matter how fucked it all gets, looking at people at the top of that, wanting to be them. And so the system is able to be perpetuated through that unwillingness to face it, and then those who do get to the top aren't willing to look at it either, because that's what they're relying upon. They're benefiting from said system. And then the ones who aren't benefiting are too caught up in wanting to benefit from it to see it for what it is. And so it takes people to look at it for what it is and let go through their shift in mentality of the need to find value in the things that the system says that it'll give you value from, like to recognize their own inherent value through just being reality, through just being what is, through being God experiencing itself. Like as you begin to let go of the idea that your value can fluctuate, of the idea of yourself as being something separate from anything, like that is the path towards letting go of all of that external validation, of all of the things that the system is promising you. Because as we let go of that, and that's the shift in mentality, there aren't people looking to be seen in a certain way. Those at the top realize, oh shit, maybe I don't need all of this stuff. Maybe all of this stuff is a lot of weight. Maybe my value isn't so much higher because of that. And then those who aren't in that situation let go of the idea that that will add value to them, and then they're able to exist as they are. Look around, recognize that, oh, I'm just reality. I'm not actually something separate from it. My value doesn't fluctuate. There are certain things that I need. There's a point of, in our current system, having enough money to, pay for those basic necessities. But in terms of going so far beyond that, like we have in our society, there's going to be implications of that. But it's such a sort of cyclical process because everyone, no matter which end of the spectrum you're on, is in that same mentality of perceiving division, believing it to be the truth. And so that has to be the shift in order for the system to shift. Otherwise, it doesn't matter what happens on the surface. It doesn't matter what happens with governmental decisions, political candidates being voted or not being voted, or I want my side to win, I want their side to lose, blah blah blah. It's like it's still perpetuating that illusion that we're at all separate. And so it's the dropping of that, it's the letting go of that will eventually shift the priorities enough to let go of the current system. But as long as our priorities remain in the way that they are right now, the system will be perpetuated because it's based on where our priorities lie. And right now they're in a very specific spot, and it doesn't matter which end of the spectrum of the system you're on, those priorities are still there.
It's so interesting that the more self-absorbed our priorities are, the more distortion is created collectively. That really is the case. And it's interesting because Saul says it in the movie because he's reflecting on how the world became what it is. And he said, still nobody tries, nobody cares. He even looks back, and at one point he says, people were always rotten, but the world was beautiful. And so it's so very interesting to me that all of this chaos, all of this suffering really is the result of an almost lazy mentality, a mentality that's just happy getting enough for me, but never really looks beyond that. And because of that, it's almost obvious where that trajectory is going almost all the time, including what Thorne realizes at the very end of the movie, which I thought was beautiful. Next thing, they'll be breeding us like cattle, because that's the next inevitable step to a mentality that's just trying to solve the problem of keeping itself going, that's settling for mere existence rather than actual life. And that's the direction we're going in right now. How many jobs do people have to hold down in order to pay their bills? What exactly is the cost of food right now compared to 5 years ago? Look how things are going. We are already in this trajectory. And it's because we don't want to stop the system. This is the best thing that we could come up with so far, right? Just got to vote, change the laws. It has nothing to do with changing our entire mentality at all, because that's very difficult. We have no idea what that means. And frankly, it's easier to just follow along.
Because it takes responsibility for yourself to not follow along, to be seen in a different way. And it's fascinating because as I was watching this, I was even thinking about, you know, getting a job and that whole process of having a job and seeing that as like not that far from a breeding process. Like it's sucking out, and this is very much similar to, like the Matrix or this movie, and it's like sucking out our energy in order to profit off of us, because they get taxes from every single person that works, that keeps the system moving. Like we pay the system in order to exist, essentially. So it's not this direct idea of breeding, but it's getting very close to that. And it just keeps, upping taxes, taking more, blah, 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 until, certain businesses are so big that they can actually flip that and not be taxed in the same way as the individuals. And so it's this process, and over the last 50 years, probably about since this movie, like we have just seen that process accelerate more and more, taking more from us. We get taxed more and more, so we are paying for the system to stay alive. Food prices get higher, inflation increases, the value of every dollar that we make goes down, and it's all happening right before our eyes. Like we're getting sucked drier and drier as we go. And inevitably, like when do we think this is going to shift or change? It isn't. It's going to go until the system implodes, or we end up with a situation like Soylent Green, or there are ends to this, and they're not pretty, and we're just not willing to look at it because we remain just comfortable enough to not want to.
If you think about it in terms of a business, rather than thinking about this as a mentality, let's look at this as a business. We don't recognize that everything currently that's running in the world, for the most part, is running under the business name of identity, ego, fear, lack, judgment, comparison. That is the business model of this particular business. And we are all invested in it because we're all playing along to its tune and its mentality. But if we were to look at another option, which would be a business that, instead of only worrying about itself, is consistently pushing the boundaries of what it considers itself to be, to include everyone, well, then that business would operate totally differently. That mentality would operate totally differently. And what I mean by that is, currently, when somebody invests in a company, they are looking to make as much profit as they can for themselves. Whether the company does well or not, unfortunately, isn't always a consideration, because some investors make good money on companies that fail. So it's always about ourselves. But if we were investing in things for the sake of the common good, not even the common good so much as what benefits all of us in general, and we were to start thinking of ourselves as the environment, not just something within that environment, then what we do with that environment would change. And that's the thing about Soylent Green. The environment is as barren as the mentality of the people who live within it in that movie. Everybody's just given up. Everybody's just scrounging for whatever will just keep them alive to the next meal. Nobody talks. Nobody trusts each other. You can see in that movie how many people just are too busy stressing out, too busy trying to survive, too busy trying to make ends meet to really connect with anyone, which is why they're so willing to sell out. Like, for example, the assassin at the beginning of the movie. He didn't care at all. He was just like, oh, sweet, meat hook. He was just looking at it as something that was going to benefit him in the short term. And we see that a lot. It's also the reason that we see more crime in areas that are impoverished. Desperation. And that desperation really does come in when you feel that you are alone. And that isolation really does come from our investment in this mentality that is very much benefiting from you feeling alone.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of this just comes down to the recognition that you are the world, that you are your environment. Like that shift, as much as people discount that, like I'll talk to people about that. And that it's like that is the core of this, is we don't see ourselves as our environment. We don't see ourselves as the world, because as that shifts away from being something in your environment, something experiencing your environment, something experiencing the world, to being it, your priorities shift. They almost have to, the more clearly that you recognize that, because it's no longer just about you and your priorities. And it doesn't even have to be, as Ray said, it doesn't have to be this, what's good for everyone else. It's like, good for everyone else is good for you, because you are still experiencing your environment. And if we keep at the trajectory that we're going, we're going to end up with an environment that's completely fucked, because we don't see ourselves. It's like we're blinded to it. The edge of me is the edge of my blinders. As that drops, you see everything more so for what it is, and see that there's something you can do within it. There's an experience that we can have that is good for the environment in terms of reality, which includes you. It's not just about this sacrificial type mentality. It comes back to being good for you through that. We're just so distorted and so desperate to feel valuable that we don't see what's going on around us. And we saw that in a number of examples throughout the movie, that everyone's just trying to feel a little bit better, just a tiny bit better than they are, because you completely lost touch with the recognition that they are the environment that they're experiencing from any level of human that you look at in Soylent Green. It's all just trying to feel a little bit better. And the mentality of believing division to be the truth is just run so rampant that the environment gets fucked, because there's no consideration for it.
It's especially obvious when you're looking at Thorne, who is a police officer, and he's wearing riot gear, and he's standing in this crowd of people who are getting fucked by the system. And he doesn't recognize this. And so he's actually working against the people that, in fact, he should be backing up. He should be supporting these people in their efforts to riot. And he's witnessing the system just come along and scoop them up as if they're just things that don't even exist as human beings. And that's it. Once his perspective changes, again, I would like to envision that at the end of the movie, Thorne does not die, but in fact goes on to help lead a revolution. That would be awesome, because really it just comes down to looking at it for what it is and not letting it crush you. Keeping it light, recognizing that we are not in Soylent Green yet. We are not in 1984. We are not at that dystopia yet. We have a lot of time, but every moment is precious. Every moment has an influence. And so each and every moment does matter. At the end of the day, it's not about what's expedient. It's not about what's easiest. The path of least resistance rarely is. And that's something that we talk about often here on the podcast. Go through it the hard way. You'll learn more about yourself for doing so. And that's true individually and collectively. But collectively, we keep trying to put off the inevitable consequence of our need for control. And that inevitable consequence is a lack of alignment with reality.
Yeah, the path of least resistance is rarely a long-term lack of resistance. It's always in the short term. And when you're blind to the implications of that path that you've chosen, that is very often, the short-term gratification, the focus on me, there's going to be implications of that. And oftentimes the path of more resistance leads to less resistance in the long term. And I think that is important to keep in mind, that there's always something to learn through every path that you take. And so taking that one that seems the most comfortable immediately isn't always what's best, but maintaining a mentality that has let go more and more of your need to be seen in any certain way, and a belief that your value fluctuates, and an idea that in order to be seen as more, you need more. As that shifts, despite it seeming like it's more resistance in the short term because you can't feel quite as good about yourself immediately, in the long term, there are so many more beneficial implications to not only reality, but to you, especially as you begin to see yourself more so as reality.
That's right. Because remember, when you are watching these dystopian stories or you're reading these dystopian stories, it's really important to keep in mind that the author, regardless of how talented they may be, could not possibly anticipate the effect of a character like you. And this is a totally different story. Let's see where it goes. And I think that's the end of this review of the movie Soylent Green. I love this movie. It's powerful. It's ahead of its time, extremely ahead of its time. It introduces so many interesting topics in terms of what's currently happening, where we might be going. We certainly did not cover all of them in this movie review by any means. But if you would like to chat about them, we would love to hear your thoughts. You can participate on Discord. You can join us on a Patreon chat. Just check out the movie. It's fantastic. And of course, Charlton Heston, he's iconic. But before we wrap up, I'm going to give Andrew his final thoughts here on the movie, because again, I know I tend to ramble all the way to the end of the episode, and it's always nice to mix it up from time to time.
No, this is a fun one to get into, because I think as much as it is dark and scary ending, it is important to keep in mind that we aren't quite there yet. There is a possibility to shift things, and I think everything we talk about pretty much every day on Dualistic Unity is that shift in mentality, is sort of the key to recognizing that there can be a different way that we have this experience. There is a different way. There is a different path. We aren't doomed to experiencing something like this. And so you have the power within yourself, the little shifts that you make throughout your day as you get caught up in judging yourself, thinking about yourself, measuring your value, comparing your experience to someone else's that you don't actually know anything about, because you couldn't possibly ever know all of the ins and outs of someone's experience. As you let go of those things and come back to where you're at, and come back to the recognition that you're it. Never what you think, but always reality. That is the shift that will allow us to have a different future. But it always starts with you. So I appreciate you tuning in to this episode. Hopefully you checked out the movie before we gave all of the spoilers to it, because it is a fantastic film, and I look forward to discussing it with a lot of you further on an upcoming Patreon call. And I'll talk to you soon.
Bye, everyone.